In 1955, two British climbers moved through the last few feet beneath the summit of Kangchenjunga. Above them stood the third highest point on Earth. They had the strength to reach it, they had the weather, they had already survived the mountain. Then they stopped. Joe Brown and George Band had made a promise before the expedition began. The summit was sacred to the people of Sikkim, and the climbers had agreed that the highest point would remain untouched. So they halted just below it and turned back. That decision created one of mountaineering's strangest boundaries. It was not a wall, it was not a guard. It was a line that existed only because people chose to recognize it. And that line has never been as simple as the legend suggests. The phrase, "forbidden mountain," sounds absolute. It suggests a locked gate at the base and a law that applies to everyone. The real world gives us something far less tidy. Some mountains are closed by governments, some are protected by religious rules, some remain technically open, while indigenous communities ask climbers to stay away. Others are dangerous tourist attractions that were never forbidden at all. One mountain on this list acquired its reputation from an old mortality statistic that no longer means what people think it means. So this is not a list of 10 identical bands. It is a list of 10 different boundaries, and of what happens when the desire to stand on a summit meets religion, politics, risk, and respect. The distinction matters. A legal prohibition can be enforced. A cultural request depends on consent. A mountain closed on one side of a border may welcome visitors on the other, and a summit left untouched by one expedition may be stepped on by the next. By the time we reach number 1, the question will no longer be whether a person can climb a mountain. It will be whether reaching the highest rock is always the same thing as completing the ascent. Number 10 is Mount Athos, Greece. Mount Athos rises from a narrow peninsula in northern Greece, but the mountain cannot be separated from the monastic territory around it. The Orthodox community has occupied the peninsula for more than 1,000 years. UNESCO describes the site as a spiritual center with 20 monasteries, a landscape where religious life, architecture, forest, and steep coastal terrain form one protected whole. The famous restriction is called the avaton. Women are not permitted to enter the monastic territory. The rule is commonly traced through centuries of monastic tradition, and modern Greek law continues to support the restriction. This is where the title begins to bend. The rule is not a simple ban on women climbing one summit. It controls entry to the autonomous monastic peninsula. A male visitor also cannot simply arrive with a backpack and walk inland. Pilgrims and other approved visitors require a permit called a diamonoterion, and daily access is limited. Athos has guarded that separation through political changes that erased entire states around it. Monastic communities were established there by the 10th century. Byzantine emperors granted privileges. Ottoman rule came and went. The modern Greek state inherited a territory whose internal order was already ancient. That continuity explains why the restriction cannot be understood as a temporary park regulation. It belongs to the constitutional and religious identity of the place. The mountain itself reaches 2,033 meters above the Aegean. Paths climb through forest toward the upper slopes, where a chapel stands near the summit. Men who have secured permission can make the ascent. Women cannot legally reach the trailhead from inside the territory. The restriction has faced criticism, including challenges within European institutions. Supporters describe it as essential to the monastic character of Athos. Critics describe it as sex discrimination maintained behind religious autonomy. Both statements point toward the same physical result. For half the population, the mountain remains beyond a controlled coastal boundary. There is something unsettling about how ordinary the mechanism looks. No supernatural force keeps anyone below. The boundary survives through paperwork, patrols, ports, custom, and the willingness of a state to defend a religious rule. Athos is therefore forbidden, but not in the way the title first implies. The summit is part of a larger enclosure. To understand the restriction, you have to stop looking at the peak and look at the society built around it. Number 9 is Gangkhar Puensum, Bhutan. At 7,570 meters, Gangkhar Puensum is widely identified as the highest mountain on Earth without a confirmed ascent. It stands in the Himalaya, near Bhutan's northern frontier with China. Even its exact placement became complicated on older maps, and unsuccessful expeditions reported difficulties matching published coordinates to the terrain. Mountaineers attempted the mountain during the 1980s, after Bhutan briefly opened selected peaks to climbing. None reached the top. The obstacle was not a single dramatic accident. Teams encountered route-finding problems, severe weather, avalanche danger, and the logistical uncertainty of a region that had received little modern climbing traffic. Several expeditions discovered that even identifying the intended approach demanded interpretation. Survey maps placed features differently, and the mountain's name appeared in multiple spellings, including Gangkhar Puensum and Gangkhar Puensum. Those variations are normal when Himalayan names move between local languages and Roman alphabets. Here, they reinforced the sense that the objective had not yet been absorbed into the standardized world of commercial expeditions. Then the rules changed. In 1994, Bhutan prohibited climbing above 6,000 meters out of respect for local spiritual beliefs. In 2003, the country moved to prohibit mountaineering altogether. Bhutanese traditions treat high peaks as the domains of deities and protective spirits. Under that view, a summit is not an empty platform waiting for a flag, it is occupied ground. The highest unclimbed mountain was not preserved by being technically impossible. It was preserved because the country responsible for its approach decided that possibility was beside the point. A Japanese team later received permission to climb Kangchenjunga in 1999 from the Tibetan side. That peak lies close to Gangkhar Puensum and is connected to it by a ridge. Reports from the expedition show how near modern mountaineering came to the forbidden objective without making a sanctioned attempt on the main summit. There are disputes around border geography and around which slopes belong to which jurisdiction. Those disputes make the story less romantic and more revealing. A sacred boundary may appear permanent on the ground while remaining contested on a map. For now, Gangkhar Puensum remains unclimbed in the recognized record. It has not defeated every possible expedition. The expeditions have been denied the opportunity to find out. That is a purer form of prohibition than Athos. There is no permit category that eventually leads to the top. The absence of a summit photograph is the intended outcome. But the next mountain complicates the idea again, because political isolation does not surround the entire peak. Number 8 is Mount Paektu. Mount Paektu stands on the border between North Korea and China. In China, the same volcanic massif is commonly called Changbaishan. At its center lies a large crater lake known as Chonji in Korean, meaning Heaven Lake, and Tianqi in Chinese. The summit region reaches approximately 2,744 meters on the Korean side. The mountain carries enormous cultural weight. Korean foundation traditions connect it with the origin of the Korean people. North Korea places it inside the state mythology surrounding the Kim family and the revolution. South Korean culture also treats Paektu as a national symbol. The mountain appears in the first line of South Korea's national anthem. Beneath the politics sits a volcano with a history large enough to ignore every border. The Paektu eruption of the 10th century ranks among the most powerful eruptions of the last several thousand years. The collapse of the summit area helped form the caldera, now occupied by Heaven Lake. Geological research on the massif continues across a region where scientific cooperation can become entangled with diplomacy. Access from North Korea has always depended on state control. Foreign visitors who reached the mountain did so through approved itineraries, transport, guides, and political permission. Changes in North Korean tourism policy can close that route without changing anything about the snow, rock, or volcanic crater. Yet, calling Paektu a mountain that climbers are universally forbidden to summit is false. The Chinese side receives tourists. Roads, buses, managed paths, and viewing areas bring visitors toward Heaven Lake from Changbaishan. UNESCO recognized the Chinese landscape as a global geopark in 2024, and in 2025, it endorsed the Mount Paektu area in North Korea as a global geopark as well. Those designations describe a protected volcanic landscape, not a peak erased from human access. The restrictions are political and geographic. A visitor's experience changes according to the passport they carry, the border they approach, and the policies in force at that moment. Even the word summit becomes slippery because the caldera rim contains multiple named peaks and viewpoints. Paektu survives on forbidden mountain lists because North Korea casts a long shadow over every place inside its borders. The secrecy is real. The control is real. The conclusion is too broad. This mountain is better understood as divided access. One government may suspend a route, another operates a major tourist destination on the same volcanic structure. That makes Paektu an important warning for the rest of the list. A place can feel closed when the story is told from only one direction. And the next mountain is often described from only one cultural direction. Number 7 is Mount Shasta, United States. Mount Shasta rises to 4,322 meters in Northern California. It is a massive stratovolcano, visible across long distances and covered by glaciers. The United States Forest Service manages the Mount Shasta wilderness, and thousands of people enter the area for hiking, skiing, and climbing. The legal facts are clear. Mount Shasta is not closed to climbers. Wilderness permits are required above the lower trailheads. A summit pass is required above 10,000 feet. Human waste must be packed out in designated systems, and climbing rangers publish safety information for routes affected by snow, rockfall, weather, and volcanic terrain. The most commonly used line, Avalanche Gulch, is a mountaineering route rather than a maintained summit trail. Conditions can shift from firm spring snow to exposed rock and falling debris as the season changes. Rangers repeatedly warn that a permit does not certify a climber's judgment or ability. It records entry and supports management. The mountain remains responsible for the rest. So why does Shasta appear in lists of forbidden summits? Because legal permission is not the only claim placed upon it. Mount Shasta is sacred to several native peoples of Northern California, including Wintu communities whose traditions identify the mountain as a place of creation and spiritual power. Indigenous advocates have repeatedly asked visitors to treat sacred places around the mountain with restraint. Concerns extend beyond the final summit rock to springs, ceremonial areas, burial places, commercial tourism, and forms of recreation that turn a living religious landscape into scenery. A request for respect is often rewritten online as a tribal ban. That rewrite is inaccurate. Tribal communities do not enforce a general legal prohibition on the standard climbing routes. The Forest Service continues to issue permits. Climbers continue to summit, but dismissing the request because it lacks federal enforcement creates another distortion. It assumes that the only meaningful boundary is one backed by a fine or an arrest. On Shasta, two maps occupy the same mountain. One marks trailheads, avalanche paths, glaciers, camps, and permit zones. The other marks relationships that cannot be reduced to recreational infrastructure. Neither map makes the other disappear. The honest description is uncomfortable. You may be legally allowed to climb, while people with a far older connection to the mountain ask you to reconsider how you do it, where you go, and what you treat as yours. Shasta is not forbidden. It tests whether climbers recognize any limit they are not forced to obey. That difference will return at Devil's Tower. Before that, there is a Himalayan peak where government policy and an expedition's promise combined to create a much firmer boundary. Number 6 is Machapuchare, Nepal. Machapuchare rises above the Annapurna region in Nepal. Its name is usually translated as Fishtail, a reference to the double summit visible from certain directions. The peak reaches 6,993 meters and dominates the skyline north of Pokhara. Its shape looks designed for a legend. A steep pyramid lifts above the valley, then divides at the top. Hindu tradition associates the mountain with Shiva. Local reverence and the peak's visual isolation have helped preserve its reputation as a sacred summit that should remain untouched. Only one expedition came close to making a recognized ascent. In 1957, a British team led by Jimmy Roberts approached the mountain. Climbers Wilfred Noyce and A.D.M. Cox pushed high on the route. Noyce's account describes a serious exploratory expedition rather than a ceremonial walk. The team negotiated difficult snow and ice on a mountain with little established information. They stopped below the summit. The expedition had agreed with Nepal's King Mahendra that the highest point would not be stepped upon. Published accounts commonly place the turnaround roughly 150 feet, or about 45 meters below the top, though exact descriptions vary. The climbers honored the promise and descended. The result resembles the first ascent of Kangchenjunga, but the histories moved in different directions. Kangchenjunga received later expeditions. Machapuchare remained closed to climbing permits. Nepal has opened hundreds of peaks to mountaineering and built an industry around expedition royalties, guides, porters, and high-altitude tourism. Machapuchare stands inside that landscape as a deliberate absence. It is photographed constantly. Trekkers move through the Annapurna sanctuary beneath it. The summit remains outside the commercial system. Claims occasionally appear that secret climbers reach the top later. None has produced evidence accepted as a confirmed ascent. The verified record still ends below the summit in 1957. That is the memorable detail here. Machapuchare did not remain unclimbed because nobody found a plausible line. Climbers reached the final section, then obeyed an agreement that placed reverence above completion. The mountain was close enough to finish. It was left unfinished anyway. Number 5 is Mount Kailash, Tibet. Mount Kailash rises in western Tibet to 6,638 meters. It stands near the sources of major Asian river systems and holds sacred meaning in Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and the Bon tradition. Few mountains gather so many distinct religious worlds around one piece of rock. Pilgrims do not travel there to conquer it, they travel around it. The ritual circuit, often called the Kora or Parikrama, covers roughly 52 kilometers around the mountain. Pilgrims cross the high Dolma La Pass, which rises above 5,600 meters. Some complete the circuit on foot over several days. Some Tibetan Buddhists perform full-body prostrations along the route, extending the journey across weeks. The crucial movement is circular, not upward. The pilgrimage accepts the mountain as a center that does not need to be occupied. Hindu tradition associates Kailash with Shiva. Tibetan Buddhist traditions connect it with Mount Meru and with the poet and teacher Milarepa. Jain tradition links the region to the liberation of the first Tirthankara. Bon tradition also treats the mountain as a sacred axis. Modern climbing expeditions have not established a route to the summit. China has not opened Kailash to mountaineering, and proposals to climb it have met religious opposition. The safest fact remains the visible one. There is no accepted ascent and no ordinary permit system for the summit. Kailash is sometimes marketed online as physically impossible, protected by strange time effects, or shaped like an artificial pyramid. Reliable geological and historical sources do not support those claims. Its unclimbed status needs no paranormal explanation. The mountain remains closed because sacredness has been translated into policy. That distinction gives Kailash unusual power. Gangkhar Puensum belongs primarily to Bhutanese spiritual geography. Machapuchare belongs to a particular Nepalese landscape. Kailash draws pilgrims from several religions and multiple countries. Any attempt would create consequences far beyond a climbing dispute. Here, the prohibition is the story. The absence of boot prints on the summit is treated as a protected condition, not a problem waiting for a more capable expedition. The next place shows what happens when authorities try to protect sacred practice without imposing a total ban. Number 4 is Devil's Tower, United States. Devil's Tower rises 264 meters above its base in northeastern Wyoming. Its near-vertical columns attract technical climbers from around the world. In 1906, President Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed it the first national monument in the United States. The formation is also sacred to more than 20 affiliated native tribes. Different traditions use different names and tell different histories connected to the site. The English name Devil's Tower came through a mistranslation during a 19th century military expedition and remains controversial. Climbing was established long before the present management debate. In 1893, local ranchers William Rogers and Willard Ripley used a wooden stake ladder driven between cracks to reach the top. Remnants of the ladder can still be seen on the rock. Modern climbers use the long vertical cracks between the columns. The National Park Service permits climbing, but since the 1990s, it has asked climbers to observe a voluntary closure during June. June carries special importance because many native ceremonies occur around the monument during that month. The word voluntary changes everything. Climbers are not generally arrested for ascending in June. The Park Service asks them not to climb. Commercial climbing guides have been restricted during the closure period, while individual compliance depends heavily on choice. Park statistics have shown large reductions in June climbing since the plan began, although some ascents continue. That compromise emerged through years of conflict. Native representatives described climbing as intrusive and disrespectful during ceremonies. Some climbers argued that federal management was favoring religion and limiting access to public land. Court challenges followed. The voluntary system survived. Look closely at the logic. A total ban would be easier to describe. An unrestricted season would be easier to enforce. Instead, the monument asks visitors to recognize a sacred calendar that may not be their own. Devil's Tower is therefore one of the clearest tests on this list. The route remains physically open. The authorities explain why restraint matters. The final decision reaches the climber before the first piece of protection goes into the rock. What happened at Shasta was often exaggerated into a ban. At Devil's Tower, a formal management plan turns the request into something more visible without making it absolute. And now the list reaches 3 mountains that expose the title itself. The first is open, crowded, and marketed to tourists. The second is open to expeditions despite its reputation for death. The third is protected by a tradition whose history is more complicated than the clean version usually repeated. The top 3 are not stronger prohibitions, they are stronger contradictions. Number 3 is Mount Hua, China. The image appears constantly online, a narrow wooden plank bolted against a vertical cliff, a chain fixed to the wall, and a drop disappearing beneath a visitor's shoes. Captions call it the world's most dangerous hike. Some claim that authorities forbid ordinary climbers from reaching the mountain's summits. They do not. Mount Hua, or Huashan, stands in Shaanxi province near the city of Huayin. It is one of China's 5 great mountains and has centuries of religious association with Taoism. The massif contains 5 principal peaks linked by paths, stairs, ridges, and modern transport. It is also a developed scenic area. Visitors buy tickets. Cable cars serve major sections. Stone stairways carry large crowds upward. Hotels, temples, food stalls, rail connections, and managed viewpoints make Huashan the opposite of a mountain removed from public access. The famous plank path is real. It is commonly called the Changkong Plank Road. Wooden boards run along a cliff on the South Peak area, and visitors clip safety harnesses to fixed lines. The attraction can close because of weather, maintenance, crowd control, or operating conditions. Participation is controlled, and the harness system matters. But the plank walk is not the only route to Huashan's peaks, and completing it is not required to visit the mountain. The internet usually removes those details. A photograph crops out the safety cable. A video emphasizes the cliff and ignores the staff, ticketing, anchors, and alternate paths. Then, a dangerous optional attraction becomes evidence that the entire mountain is forbidden. Huashan has genuine hazards. Historic routes contain steep stairways and exposed sections. Rain, ice, wind, fatigue, and crowds can transform managed infrastructure into serious risk. Authorities can close areas when operating conditions demand it. None of that creates a permanent summit prohibition. This entry belongs here because it shows how forbidden place mythology is manufactured. The raw material is an authentic mountain, an authentic sacred history, and an authentic cliffside route. The false conclusion arrives through editing. There is another layer. Taoist hermits and temples gave the mountain a long religious identity before mass tourism arrived. That sacred history now coexists with cable cars and viral challenge videos. The tension is not between access and prohibition. It is between pilgrimage, entertainment, and the modern appetite for a photograph that looks uncontrolled. Mount Hua may be frightening. It may be regulated. Portions may close temporarily. Climbers are not forbidden to summit it. The mountain was placed on the list because danger is often mistaken for denial. That same mistake created the legend surrounding number 2, except the numbers there are far more serious. Number 2 is Annapurna 1, Nepal. Annapurna 1 rises to 8,091 meters in north-central Nepal. It became the first mountain above 8,000 meters to receive a confirmed ascent when Maurice Herzog and Louis Lachenal reached the summit on June 3, 1950. Their French expedition entered largely unknown terrain, found a route on the north side, and paid heavily during the descent. Herzog and Lachenal suffered severe frostbite. The expedition doctor performed amputations during the return. The published story turned Annapurna into a symbol of heroic suffering and helped shape post-war Himalayan mountaineering. The victory narrative also concealed how narrow the margin had become. The climbers lost equipment during the retreat, struggled to identify the route through storms, and depended on teammates and Sherpa members to move them towards safety. Their summit solved the geographical problem of reaching 8,000 meters. It did nothing to make descent from that altitude predictable. The mountain later acquired another identity, the deadliest of the 8,000-meter peaks. For years, articles repeated a simple ratio. For every 3 climbers who reached the summit, 1 person died. The statistic came from comparing recorded deaths with successful summit ascents during periods when Annapurna had relatively few climbers and a high number of fatal accidents. That ratio was never a law of the mountain. It was a snapshot produced by a particular calculation over a particular period. Modern Himalayan statistics change as expeditions add ascents, deaths, route choices, and rescues. Guinness World Records, citing Himalayan database figures updated through the end of the 2025 season, reported 75 deaths and 559 successful ascents on Annapurna 1. That produces a death-to-summit ratio near 13%. Still appalling, but nowhere close to 1 in 3. Different measures answer different questions. Deaths divided by summits does not equal the probability that any individual climber will die. One climber may summit more than once. Many climbers turn back. Some deaths occur without a summit attempt reaching the top. Statistics may include or separate support personnel in different ways. Annapurna remains exceptionally dangerous even after the old slogan is removed. The mountain's normal routes pass beneath unstable snow and ice. Avalanches have killed climbers at high camps and on sections that teams must cross repeatedly. Weather changes quickly. The descent begins after exhaustion has already accumulated. In October 2014, a severe storm and avalanches across the wider Annapurna region killed dozens of trekkers, guides, and local residents. That disaster occurred largely on trekking routes rather than the technical route on Annapurna 1, but it demonstrated how rapidly the region's weather can overwhelm people at altitude. And the claim that Annapurna is worse than K2 depends on the metric and date selected. K2 has its own changing record, its own concentration of technical hazards, and catastrophic seasons such as 1986 and 2008. Comparing the two with one permanent percentage hides more than it reveals. Here is the correction that matters for this list. Nepal issues permits for Annapurna 1. Expeditions climb it. In recent years, improved forecasting, route preparation, helicopter support at lower elevations, and accumulated knowledge have helped more teams operate on the mountain, though none can remove avalanche exposure. Annapurna is not forbidden. It is allowed, documented, commercialized, and capable of killing experienced people despite all four. The false prohibition grows from a psychological boundary. A danger becomes so notorious that people begin describing it as if no rational person is permitted to cross it. But mountaineering history is full of people who crossed exactly those boundaries. The wooden boards on Mount Hua looked forbidden because of the drop beneath them. Annapurna looks forbidden because a historical ratio follows its name. In both cases, fear has been translated into a rule that does not exist. Number 1 is Kangchenjunga. Kangchenjunga reaches 8,586 meters on the border of Nepal and the Indian state of Sikkim. It is the third highest mountain on Earth, below Everest and K2. Its name is commonly translated as the 5 treasures of the high snow, referring to the mountain's 5 major peaks. For communities in Sikkim, Kangchenjunga is not simply terrain. It is associated with a guardian deity and with the sacred geography of the region. UNESCO recognized Kangchenjunga National Park as a World Heritage Site in 2016 for both its natural qualities and its cultural landscape, where mountains, lakes, caves, forests, and religious traditions are connected. The first serious British reconnaissance took place in the early 20th century. In 1905, an expedition involving Aleister Crowley attempted the mountain and ended in disaster when an avalanche killed several members. Paul Bauer led German attempts from the Sikkim side in 1929 and 1931. Neither reached the summit. After Everest was climbed in 1953, Kangchenjunga became one of the largest remaining objectives in the Himalaya. A British expedition led by Charles Evans approached from Nepal in 1955. The route crossed the Yalung Glacier and climbed through terrain threatened by avalanches and icefall. Joe Brown and George Band formed the first summit pair. On May 25, 1955, they reached the upper mountain. Norman Hardy and Tony Streether followed the next day. Before the expedition, the climbers had given an assurance that they would respect Sikkimese belief and avoid stepping on the highest point. Brown and Band stopped a few feet below the summit. The second pair observed the same commitment. They climbed the mountain and they left its final point alone. That sentence became one of mountaineering's most repeated stories. It offers a graceful solution to an old conflict. The climbers prove their ability. The sacred summit remains inviolate. Achievement and restraint occupy the same photograph. But the later history refuses to stay graceful. Kangchenjunga has been climbed many times since 1955, primarily from Nepal. Some climbers have continued to observe the tradition of stopping short. Others have reported standing on the true summit. Modern disputes sometimes concern whether photographs prove that a climber reached the exact highest point, because the upper ridge contains features that can be confused in cloud or exhaustion. The summit is therefore not universally untouched. The original promise did not become an enforceable global rule on every route. On the Indian side, the restriction became stronger. Sikkim closed sacred peaks to mountaineering, including Kangchenjunga, after protests over attempts that local religious leaders and communities considered offensive. Access from Sikkim is prohibited. Expeditions operating from Nepal face a different legal system. The mountain contains both realities at once: a genuine regional ban and a voluntary summit tradition beyond that jurisdiction. This is why Kangchenjunga belongs at number 1. It exposes every weakness in the word forbidden. A government can close an approach without controlling the other side of an international border. A community can define a summit as sacred without making every foreign expedition obey. A climber can stop below the top and still be recognized as having completed the ascent. Another climber can stand on the highest point and discover that the additional few feet settle nothing about respect. The boundary here is smaller than the one around Athos, quieter than the policy protecting Kailash, and harder to see than the dune closure at Devil's Tower. It may measure only a few vertical feet, yet those feet contain law, religion, national borders, expedition ethics, and the private decision made by a person who has already survived the entire mountain. There is a practical problem as well. At 8,586 meters, nobody remains in a calm philosophical state. Climbers near the summit operate with little oxygen, limited time, poor judgment, and extreme fatigue. Turning around below an objective requires discipline, even when weather forces the decision. Turning around in good conditions because of a promise requires a different kind of control. The history of mountaineering usually rewards the opposite instinct. Records belong to the first, the fastest, the youngest, the oldest. Success is measured by the highest coordinate reached. Kangchenjunga introduced a competing measurement. How close could someone come and still choose not to possess the final stone? The first ascent answered with restraint. Later ascents answered in several different ways. Sikkim answered with law. Nepal answered with permits. The mountain did not answer at all. From a distance, the summit remains a thin white edge above the clouds. The map places a precise elevation beside it. Expedition records place names and dates beneath it. Religious tradition places a presence there that cannot be measured by an altimeter. Somewhere below that highest point is an invisible line. No rope marks it, no sign announces it. Every climber has to decide whether it exists before reaching it. And by the time the line becomes visible, the decision has already been made.